Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon for some. We're just going to take a couple minutes and let people trickle in. All right. Thank you all for joining this month's critical vulnerability briefing. We're going to save all questions until the end, so feel free to put any questions you might have in the chat or in the Q&A section. All right. I'm going to hand it off to Scott. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you guys for attending this month's critical vulnerability briefing. Um, my name's Scott. I head up vulnerability and patching services here at Novacoast. Um, and I do apologize due to some scheduling conflicts. We did not have a session last month, and I'm sure all of you noticed and we're very sad that this was not on your calendar in the month of April, but we are in fact back. And as always, for those of you who've attended these briefings before, this is certainly a repeat, but for those of you for whom this is the first time, I always like to highlight the objectives. And in this case, as all of you know, the volume of CVEs increases every day, it seems like, especially with the advent of, attackers more heavily leveraging AI. Specifically, I'm sure everyone at this point has heard and lit their hair on fire over Anthropic's Mythos capability, which not only, has just dumped vulnerabilities, previously undiscovered CVEs, um, into the ecosystem, but more importantly, uh, facilitates the speed with which attackers can weaponize exploits against against those vulnerabilities. So what we like to do, rather than focus too much on any specific vulnerabilities, or rather uh, attack paths, technical deep dives on attacker TTPs, and breaking down exploits. This is more of highlighting, hey, what should be on your radar if you do nothing else this maintenance cycle? What should you take care of? What shouldn't be in your vulnerability scan results at the end of the maintenance cycle? And then whenever we detect one or think it worthy of mention, call out any sort of trends that we see. So we'll start kind of as always with Patch Tuesday. Depending on what you're using to keep score, 118, 120 total CVEs addressed, all the way up to I've seen as high as 130, depending on who you're citing as the CVE issuing authority. Um, I'm taking 118. You see the breakdown between critical and important, probably about twice the number of critical vulnerabilities from April's Patch Tuesday release. But still, the trend remains where privilege elevation vulnerabilities are outpacing code execution by about two times the amount. One thing that kind of a don't uncork the champagne because this held true for about 24 hours. But on the date of release, last Tuesday, it was the first time since June of 2024 that Microsoft did not address a zero-day vulnerability, whether it bore the title because it was under active exploitation in the wild or POC was publicly released prior to the Patch Tuesday release. Like I said, that held true for a very short amount of time. So really quickly, and I'm not going to get too far in the weeds on the higher risk vulnerabilities. As I said, no zero days, but there are certainly some concerning vulnerabilities. I kept this one or this little checklist just to CVEs that actually do require some sort of action, whether it's a O365 or Office Apps update or the May 2026 cumulative update. If you guys are bean counting, you'll notice there were quite a few vulnerabilities on the Azure side. Um, Quite a few of them had a critical severity rating. Those don't require any action. They should be subject to service side remediation, so you should be covered on that front. Um, the ones in red, the Jira Confluence privilege escalation, and then the code execution affecting net logon, those were the two spookiest in terms of CVSS score for what that's worth. Um, and then certainly the kernel privilege elevation vulnerabilities, only two of the three were assessed as exploitation more likely, despite the fact that they all bore the same CVSS score. And then similarly on the Word, Microsoft Word RCE vulnerabilities, you see same CVSS score. The preview pane is a valid attack vector for all four, but only two, 40361 and 64, were rated per Microsoft's exploitability index as exploitation more likely. I did note the exploitability index rating where it was applicable, though this month, as is the case with most months, not a lot of details from Microsoft as to why certain vulnerabilities, particularly when we're looking at the Windows kernel and the Microsoft Word vulnerabilities, where, what makes two of the three in the case of the kernel and two of the four in the case of Word more likely to be exploited than others when they have the um, same attack path, same characteristics. Like I said, scarce details, you know, apply the cumulative update, or, update Office apps, O365, etc. That's going to be the remediation pathway. So it's not like any of these have special handling instructions. Um, Really quickly, probably the one that got the most attention was the SSO plugin for Jira and Confluence. In that you can essentially circumvent Entra ID authentication, and it would allow you. It certainly gives you access and allows you to modify data in Jira or Confluence. Um, this one I would not be surprised if it makes its way onto the Sysakev at some point. It does seem to be a pretty easy exploit to throw. So, if you were going to, I'm sure all of you have at the very least completed your test slash pilot um, rings in your monthly maintenance cycle. But if there was any reason to expedite on any expedite remediation on any applicable systems, this would be a good candidate. The Windows kernel vulnerabilities, not a ton to say here in terms of just overall uniqueness, other than the fact that the Windows kernel, these, including these three CVEs, we have a total in 5 months to date in 2026, and these are the total of 13 privilege escalation vulnerabilities alone that Microsoft has addressed affecting the Windows kernel. As we'll see, the Windows kernel is not the only kernel being targeted heavily, but we'll get to that later. And then to wrap up the higher risk vulnerabilities, um, those of you who've been here before, and even if you haven't joined this brief before, but pay attention to the Patch Tuesday advisories, seeing a handful or more of vulnerabilities that affect Word, Excel, what have you, for which the preview pane is an attack vector that should not be unfamiliar to you. The only thing to say here is that it does require some end user interaction with a malicious file. So, we know end users would never make the mistake of inadvertently opening up a malicious file. So I'm sure you're all safe. But and then last but not least, the net logon code execution vulnerability that had the highest CVE rating. This one, even though it's remotely exploitable without authentication, um, there are some other parameters beyond just the targeted server running as a domain controller that make this slightly more difficult. The attack complexity is a little bit higher. So, as best as I can determine, that's why it got the exploitation less likely. But definitely, look at your domain controllers, ensure that they get the May updates as soon as is operationally feasible. So, moving on, and you recall the first slide where we were breaking down May Patch Tuesday, and I have March up here because I'll change that. But it was a short-lived moment for the No Zero days, as I'm sure, or I hope most of you have heard of the artist who goes by Chaotic or Nightmare Eclipse, take your pick, who's apparently a former Microsoft employee who feels wronged by the company, and going on his second month in a row now of releasing essentially 0 day exploits immediately following Patch Tuesday. Two in April that both targeted Windows Defender. Those were both privilege escalation vulnerabilities that are released on the 2nd and the 15th, that both granted system privileges to the attackers. This month, we had technically three. So the first two that came out the day after the May 12th Patch Tuesday release, Yellow Key and Green Plasma. Um, Yellow Key, probably the scariest, in that it bypasses sec bypass vulnerability affecting BitLocker. And then Green Plasma, this one was sort of a partial POC. There, it might all be out there now in GitHub or wherever you'd want to consume that information. But when he released it on the 13th, um, that privilege elevation vulnerability that targets ctfmon.exe, it was only partially disclosed, and he kind of left the latter half of it, sort of the push to the finish line, as like a capture the flag type activity. If you look at his posts, um, both uh, have significant impact. Um, Fortunately, I guess the scope is somewhat small, um, but Windows 11 Server 22, 2022, 2025, which we'd like everyone to be running a currently supported OS, but you kind of dodge a bullet if you are still running Windows 10 or older versions of Windows Server for those two particular exploits. Perhaps even more unique, though, was the one he came out with, I guess over the weekend, really started to get traction. And I saw more articles on the 17th, and that was the mini plasma exploit. This is essentially a long since discovered, it was actually identified by Google researchers in September of 2020. This flaw in the cloud filter driver that again allows system privileges. What Nightmare Chaotic Eclipse demonstrated is essentially he was able to throw the same exploit that the Google researchers presented to Microsoft in September 2022. Um, and Microsoft, or for which I should say, Microsoft issued a patch in its December, I think I said 2022, 2020, in its December 2020 Patch Tuesday release, through that very same exploit at a fully patched Windows 11 box. And by fully patched, meaning to include the May 2026 cumulative update, and was able to open up a command prompt with system privileges and just have at it. So, what could have happened? Was it a faulty patch? Did Microsoft roll it back without really telling anyone? Who knows? Either way, a little unsure. I mean, there is a CVE ID associated with this particular flaw. Um, However, most vulnerability scanning tools are going to be looking for, to determine whether or not you're vulnerable, they're going to be looking for the presence or the absence of the December 2020 cumulative update, that KB that should have addressed this particular CVE. If it's the case that even if you installed that KB and the box is patched and this exploit still works, it's a bad day. Um, so I wish I had some really good guidance for that. But there essentially there are checks that you can look for, specifically for yellow key and green plasma, in whatever EDR, XDR tooling you're using to look for um, privilege elevation activity associated with um, the processes in question that are targeted. But beyond that, I guess be standing by for Microsoft to issue either an out-of-band update or have updates to these exploits rolled into the June cumulative update. Though, given the potential impact of these, that would seem like an awful long time to wait for those patches. All right, let's move on to the Linux kernel. Um, and again, hopefully you guys have been keeping pace. Most people, I'm sure, have heard of them since all of these CVEs have cool, sexy aliases. The first one that popped up that kind of started this string of local privilege escalation vulnerabilities on multiple, in most cases, almost all Linux distros was copyfail. That was actually came out on the 29th. To date, the only one of the five that has actually been added to the CISA-KEV. As a matter of fact, I believe on the 15th of this month was when that should have been remediated, based on the timeline that CISA issued in accordance with the binding operational directive from DHS. Um, Moving on from copy fail, two CVEs that fell under the umbrella of dirty frag. Essentially, the first one, 43284, aka copy fail 2. But it can be chained with 43500, which came out only a few days later. Um, Very similar to copy fail, and we'll take a look at why in a second. Then Fragnesia came out a few days after that. Again, another privilege elevation vulnerability on the Linux kernel. And then the most recent from this week was that SSH key sign pawn. So all three essentially similar impact, very similar in some cases. The case of like copy fail, dirty frag, almost identical um, attack methodology. But again, since most people will have some sort of SLA associated with anything, any CISA Kev catalog entry, copy fail is the one that sort of pings most loudly on everyone's radar. But one note as we kind of, well, be a couple notes as we walk through the remediation slash mitigations that different Linux vendors have thrown out there. Um, Bear in mind that updating the Linux kernel to address copy fail does not protect you against the subsequent variants that have been released. So obviously, I understand, as does everyone, that updating applying patches to or kernel updates to Red Hat, Debian, Ubuntu, et cetera, plus a system reboot is not as easy as, say, dealing with you know, Google when they release 4 versions of Chrome in a month. But, obviously, we do want to apply the remediation whenever possible. However, in the case of these vulnerabilities, there are mitigations that are much more or much less impactful that do protect you. Um, I didn't get into the weeds on exactly, the commands, the exact commands that you'd have to issue to enable these mitigations. But essentially, for each of these um, local privilege elevation vulnerabilities on the Linux kernel, there you can either block, remove, disable the affected kernel modules that will protect you against exploitation. Um, Highly recommended these to any one of my customers. One, just to reduce the time it takes them to the mean time to remediate, while they're waiting for vendors to release updated versions of the kernel, apply the mitigation, disable the modules if feasible. In some cases, could have operational, I shouldn't say operational impact in terms of, don't think of that in terms of downtime, but more if functionality is required, you might have to wait for the kernel update. But certainly, I think speak from experience for those customers that I had that sort of dragged heels and said, well, why would I want to apply the mitigation? I'll just wait a few days for, Red Hat, let's say, to issue issue a formal update that'll remediate it. As you can see, when you see multiple vulnerabilities all targeting, uh, the same component, it's very much in the crosshairs of attackers who are heavily leveraging AI. And I think the more time you wait to to enable any sort of mitigation technique, the more exposed, certainly the broader your attack surface, the more exposed you are for the greater amount of time. So I don't think we've seen the last of these. I'm sure in the next few days we'll see yet another iteration of this sort of family of vulnerabilities, if you'd like to think of it that way. Um, but and certainly, um, I hate to say it, but or said it before, say it again. Don't pay attention to the CVSS score. um, Attackers certainly don't. The only good thing that I will say about all of these vulnerabilities is that they are not remotely exploitable. They are local elevation of privilege vulnerabilities. So if there's any solace, it would you could take it in that. All right. So two things as we sort of come to the end, and I know I got to hurry up here. I did want to talk about browser updates, and sort of tie that into what we were talking about, um, AI generated vulnerability detection, more importantly, exploit weaponization, um, that is AI driven. Should come as no surprise now that we are in the middle of a pretty big paradigm shift where it's becoming, increasingly difficult for those of us on the defense side of the cyber landscape to keep pace with AI's ability to discover flaws, to piece together exploits, and weaponize those exploits against those flaws. And what really, well, I'll start with Defender. We'll go to browsers in a second. I pulled out the two most recent Defender vulnerabilities that hit the Sysakev catalog yesterday. I did have a lot of questions about those from my customers, like, hey, I'm looking in Tanium, I'm looking in Tenable, I'm looking in Qualys. I don't even see like a vulnerability definition yet. There's no plugin, there's no QID, there's nothing. Um, and really what we're seeing here is, like, when I say paradigm shift, waiting for vendors to pump out checks for vulnerabilities that for vulnerabilities as quickly as AI can discover them, going to put us increasingly behind the power curve. So I pulled these two. Um, just, hey, what was I telling customers? Don't wait for a check. Go straight to the vendor advisory, identify the affected component, identify the vulnerable version of the component. In the case here, you could see the platform, anti-malware platform itself in Defender, and then the protection engine version for the latter vulnerability. And then go in and find out what version you're running, um, and take the appropriate action. I call this out not so much for you guys to focus on, the strings of numbers as to what's vulnerable and, what in what version has the vulnerability been addressed, but more so to, just sort of highlight a point and, the increasingly common trend of CVEs are coming out. They're getting a lot of attention on threat boards. They make their way into the Sysakev. They're talked about on the dark web. There's POC code published in GitHub, etc. And your vulnerability scanning tool seems to be, slow off the blocks in terms of publishing a check for those vulnerabilities. And then, what are the consequences of that? We need to wait for a check to come out. We need to scan our environment. We need to generate a report and then alert stakeholders in our enterprise who are responsible for patching, or applying updates to take action per that report. We're getting to the stage where executing operations according to that paradigm is just going to keep putting us further and further behind the power curve. And we have to find a way to do it more nimbly. I know, there is tooling out there that does this, but just be advised, if it seems like there's no check for the vulnerability that your boss is saying, what are we doing about this? You're going to have to go dig a little deeper, maybe bring some other tools, incorporate some other tools into your processes. Um, be vigilant about reading vendor advisories to do what you can to identify, like I said, what vendor, what product is affected, what version, what do I need to do to fix it, or what can I do to mitigate the threat? Um, and I think we're at time. Yeah, we are. So we can get to browsers next week, but yet another tie-in to um, vendors receiving input about previously undiscovered flaws. If you guys, have noticed, Chrome, Edge, Firefox, those updates that have been coming out since the beginning of April, those versions aren't your typical, hey, Google released a new version of Chrome specifically to address a vulnerability that was added to the Cycav catalog. Those are covering dozens of previously undiscovered vulnerabilities. In some cases, like for the Chromium-based browsers, the volume is similar to what we see Microsoft address on a given Patch Tuesday. So if you haven't automated your browser updates and you're on some sort of cycle where, hey, we update our browser to the current version of name your favorite browser once a month, you're going to notice significant spikes in your cumulative vulnerabilities. And by the time you do update, there probably have already been subsequently released versions that cover even more CVEs. So if you're not already doing so, I would make that a maturity item to automate, whether it's browsers or other commonly deployed applications that have minimal impact and require minimal, less testing than, say, an OS security patch. Uh, I would I would make that a maturity priority. And with that, sorry for going over, but I will turn it back over to you, Beth.
All right, yeah. Sorry, we're a little bit over. Our team will be sending slides and recordings if you do have questions. I know we have one in the chat really quick. The question is how to balance patching. It says with it breaking something. I think maybe we mean without breaking something. What about the testing phases of pushing patches to dev?
Do it as quickly as possible. I'm certainly not saying that you should eliminate regressive testing. I mean, the attackers do have an advantage in that the only thing they care about is attacking. Everyone on this call has something else that their organization is prioritizing, whether it's making widgets, whether it's delivering patient care, providing some service to some set of customers. We can't patch so aggressively that we run the risk of being unable to perform whatever duty it is that our organization performs. But I would say any place, whether we do it through processes, like expedited processes, or expediting our processes, incorporating new tooling, anything that we can do to at least speed up our ability to respond to these threats. That should be a maturity initiative for your organization, in addition to becoming even better than we already are at the basics. That is, how quickly can we reduce our mean time to apply OS patches? And how successful are we at doing that across the enterprise? How quickly can we update out of date software? How quickly can we address basic system misconfigurations that contribute to the attack surface? Um, be brilliant at the basics, basic cyber hygiene. But we're going to also need to add some tools to the toolbox to keep pace with some of these threats as they come. And if you want a better answer than that sort of like 30,000 foot view, hit me up on email. We could have a sidebar. I don't want to keep everyone too long.
All right, yeah, again, our team will be sending the slides and recording from today. So feel free to reach out and we can get any questions answered as well. Again, yeah, Scott obviously is an amazing resource. So thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you guys for coming.